All right, let's get started. Chag Atzmaut Sameach, everybody. Happy Yom Haatzmaut. Good to celebrate Israel's 72nd birthday with you today here on Zoom, and I hope everybody's been able to see some of the Yom HaZikaron program the other night that our community did, and I know today there's a Yom Haatzmaut program, and we're very happy and excited that we're able to have with us today live from Kfar Dumim, live from Israel, Haviv Rettig Gur. Haviv is Haviv's an Israeli journalist who's the senior analyst at the Times of Israel, the Times of Israel website, which we've had David Horowitz, the editor-in-chief, speak here at the synagogue in the past, and it's always a wonderful place to go for news. He's covered Israeli politics for the country's foreign and regional policies since 2005. And he's reported from over 20 countries, is fluent in Hebrew and English, and is a sought-after lecturer in Israel and abroad on Israeli society and history, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and more. He also was the director of communications for the Jewish Agency for Israel, and he teaches history and politics at prestigious Israeli premilitary academies. That's the official bio. We also have been very fortunate, Rabbi Lindemann and myself, on our Israel trips, to have Haviv come and speak to our group. A couple years ago, I know Rabbi Lindemann's trip, Haviv came and spoke to them, and just this last August, when I was in Israel with our TBS family trip, Haviv came to our hotel and also spoke to our group. And he's really very knowledgeable and very insightful, and we're really happy to be able to have him with us today to help us celebrate Yom Haatzmaut and also reflect a little bit on what's been going on in Israel. The truth is, if we wouldn't be in the middle of this pandemic, I'm sure we have been talking a lot more about the elections and the new government and all of that here at the synagogue. We've had some other things on our mind, but now we have a chance to pause and to hear from an expert about what's happening in terms of the Israeli government, what's happening in Israel now with COVID-19, and also just some reflections on Israel's 72nd year. So the way it's going to work is Haviv is going to start, and he's going to kind of give us an overview of some of these topics. Then if you have questions as he's speaking or that you'd like to ask, as Alex said, you're welcome to write them in the chat, and Alex and I will moderate the questions and ask them to Haviv. You're not able to unmute yourself for this meeting just to make sure everybody can hear Haviv and what's going on, but we do certainly welcome your questions via the chat, and we'll ask them on your behalf. So it's my pleasure to hand things over to Haviv Rettig Gur.
Thank you, Rabbi. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody. Thank you for having me. First of all, welcome to my home. This is my study. It's my aspirational room. There's a guitar behind me. There's a treadmill behind me. So now you know what I would be doing. If I did all those things that I would like to be doing. We've been catching glimpses of colleagues' homes, kitchens, bedrooms, all the different places. We've been doing Zoom calls over the last 6 weeks. It's a very strange time, and somehow we're managing to hold it all together, to have communities. So I really appreciate being here. Beyond just being invited to speak to you, there's something poignant about holding this and about meeting together, and I appreciate that. Welcome to Israeli politics. I'll speak not too long. Try and give some of the broad brushstrokes of what's been happening. What's been happening in Israeli politics over the last 18 months has been astonishing, unprecedented. This has never happened before. Israelis themselves have no idea where things are going. And we're all a little bit making it up as we go along, learning new things about our constitution as we go along. And we're at a moment of profound change also, and I'll get into that. The Knesset has until next Thursday, until May 7th, to change the Israeli constitution. And of course, you know there isn't exactly an Israeli constitution. There's a series of basic laws that are almost a constitution, but nevertheless to amend them in some fundamental ways in order to form a new unity government before, by law, they have to then call a fourth election in a row, a fourth consecutive election after 3 will have failed to form a government. So these are big dramatic times, and everything I'm going to say to you, I'm a journalist. Journalism is said to be the first draft of history. We try to make it a decent draft, but the first draft of anything is going to be sloppy. And so everything I say to you is a little bit preliminary. In other words, what is Netanyahu thinking? What is Benny Gantz thinking? Where are Israeli politics headed? I'm hoping that you will get not so much exact predictions of the future as a bit of the vocabulary and a bit of the ideas and a bit of the struggles that are going to guide us going forward, that will help you interpret what happens in the news over the next 2 weeks, but also over the next few months. So that's my goal. Let me start at the beginning, run through the politics. I'll touch on the Corona issues, say something about Independence Day, and then open it up for Q&A and deal with whatever interests you. In December of 2018, a long time ago already, in December of 2018, the 20th Knesset of Israel voted to dissolve itself. It's not so strange. It was a little bit early. Knesset has 4 years. It was leaning toward the end of its 4th year. Most Knessets dissolved themselves early for reasons of politics. And it voted to dissolve itself and go to an election, which was set for April 9th. And then we went to an election April 9th. Everything's standard. We all understand what is happening. And then Benjamin Netanyahu has a little bit more support at the end of that election than his major opponent, Benny Gantz. And Benjamin Netanyahu gets the nod from the president to try to form a coalition in parliament. Benjamin Netanyahu thinks he has it all in the bag. The right wing has a majority in the Knesset, and he leaves everything essentially to the last day. He is convinced he has all the cards. No right-wing party can afford not to be in his coalition. On the last day, they'll all be so desperate to get into his guaranteed government that they won't demand too much as far as cabinet posts, as far as policy influence. And when I say last day, what I'm referring to is a prime minister candidate who the president says can form, one of the members of Knesset, the president says, you can go ahead and form a government. That prime minister candidate has 28 days in which to form a government. The president can extend for another 14. So if you're doing the math, that is 42, I believe. And at the end of those 42 days, it's really 7 weeks. It's 49 days because at the beginning, the president has 7 days in which to consult with all the different parties to decide who he's going to pick. And then at the end of those 7 weeks, the deadline is passed and this person loses by law the chance to be prime minister, to form a government. It can either go to another person or a 21-day period begins in which the Knesset has a chance for any member of Knesset to form a government if they can cobble together a majority, and then we go to elections. That was a little moment of technicalities because it's fundamentally important to what happened next. On May 30, at the end of Netanyahu's 42 days, it turned out, Netanyahu found this out on the last day, that one of the right-wing parties that he thought was in the bag, Israel Beitenu, a secularist, fairly right-wing on national security issues, but very, very liberal on religion and state issues, a party whose voters are mostly Russian-speaking Israelis, refused to join his coalition, refused to go in to his government. And what that meant was he now had, I believe it was 56 members of Knesset, instead of the 63 or 64 that he needed, or 61 majority in the 120-seat Knesset to form a coalition. Now, Benjamin Netanyahu suddenly had a problem. If he lets the time run out on him, the president will ask Benny Gantz to be prime minister, and Benjamin Netanyahu is voted out of power. So Benjamin Netanyahu did something that has never been done before in Israeli history. He called elections in an interim Knesset. There has never been an Israeli election that failed to form a government. And on May 30, 2019, Benjamin Netanyahu said, well, if I'm not going to be prime minister, we'll do this again. We'll have a new election because I don't want my opponent to be prime minister. In Israel, you don't win an election on election day. You win an election after you negotiate a majority coalition in the parliament. So no one had yet won, and Benjamin Netanyahu wanted to make sure that Benny Gantz didn't win. And he actually got the support of the Arab parties. The Arab parties had seen a dip in their voters in their voter turnout. So they sided with Netanyahu and they agreed to vote for a new election. And the 21st Knesset dissolved itself before forming a government. Since that day, since May 30, we have been in an insane, no man's land. We have no experience of this before. The election was called for September. The September election came and went, and Benjamin Netanyahu had a problem. The problem was that he actually did worse in September than in April. And Israel Beitenu, the Russian-speaking secularist right-wing party that refused to sit in his coalition because they had tremendous disagreements on domestic policies, religion and state issues with the ultra-Orthodox parties and other issues, Israel Beitenu almost doubled the size of its support. In other words, when Avigdor Lieberman, the head of Israel Beitenu, refused to sit with Netanyahu, his voters were thrilled by that and actually expanded his Knesset seat, his Knesset delegation or faction from 5 seats to 8 seats. So Benjamin Netanyahu was in an even bigger problem in September than he was in April. But he also couldn't just call an election. For one thing, the Arab parties shot up, and so they had done very well in September. There was a huge turnout for them, and they were not interested in new elections, so he didn't have a majority to even call new elections. He let his own time run out, and then he let Benny Gantz's time run out. Benny Gantz also failed to form a coalition. The right-wing parties around Netanyahu stayed extremely loyal to him, which is also remarkable. We've never seen that kind of loyalty between parties. Left-wing parties have sat in right-wing coalitions. Labor has sat in Netanyahu coalitions. Meretz has sat in coalitions with Likud. Right-wing parties have sat in coalitions led by Olmert, who's a former Likud minister, but ran in 2006 on pulling out of the West Bank. He had really become a representative of the left later in his career, and right-wing parties were sitting with him in his coalition. Parties always crossed the aisle when it suited their purposes. And suddenly, after the September race, that stopped happening. We suddenly saw an extraordinary thing. We saw a right-wing bloc of ultra-Orthodox and right-wing parties around Benjamin Netanyahu hold the line across 3 elections. The election in March changed nothing. After Netanyahu and Gantz both failed because of the loyalty of their camps, we then went to an election in March, and that returned the same fundamental. There was a little bit of change. The Arab parties rose even a little bit more. Israel Beitenu lost, I think, 1 seat. It all essentially remained the same. Neither Netanyahu nor Gantz had their coalition, and both sides remained tremendously loyal to these 2 camps. What's fascinating about these 2 camps is that we never had these 2 camps. We had no idea that there was this pro-Netanyahu 59-seat coalition in Israeli politics that would loyally follow him through 3 indecisive elections, and that there was an anti-Netanyahu. It's sort of pro-Gantz, but it wasn't really pro-Gantz. The Arab parties are not pro-Gantz at all. An anti-Netanyahu, 61 seats in the case of the March election, that also would sustain itself and even grow slightly across 3 elections. So we suddenly saw the formation of these 2 fascinating and brand new camps. One word, it's very common today to make fun of Benny Gantz, the head of Blue and White, the former chief of staff of the Israeli army, the major challenger to Benjamin Netanyahu, really the most significant challenge Benjamin Netanyahu has faced in 11 years as prime minister. Benny Gantz has done something extraordinary that reconfigured Israeli politics. He is a chief of staff of the army who is famous for never raising his voice. He's supposed to be very handsome. I don't see his handsomeness. I don't want to malign the man. Some people do. I think what they're referring to when they say handsome is that he has blue eyes. In Israel, most of us do not have blue eyes. Even those who did married Yemenites, and so the kids no longer do. And I think what, Benny Gantz has this reputation of being a very, very soft-spoken, very calm, very thoughtful man who is not up to the kind of predatory, aggressive politics that Benjamin Netanyahu is famous for. And so Benjamin Netanyahu is going to clean up with him, and he's going to chew him up and spit him out. That is what everybody thought, and everyone was writing, a year ago Never mind, the last month when he's actually broke up his coalition and went to join Netanyahu in a unity government. It's easy to say that Benny Gantz is a kind of political neophyte, a weakling, a quiet man. He gave one speech in which he pointed at the air and he raised his voice. And it turned out he had been coached for hours in how to stand in front of a camera and raise your voice and sound aggressive, because that was part of the campaign strategy. Now you're getting aggressive. He's not an aggressive man. But you also don't rise to the top of the Israeli military hierarchy by being a stupid man. We discovered that he has a kind of leadership style that is essentially bringing together all kinds of different competing forces and making them work together. The blue and white coalition that Benny Gantz has led across 3 elections is a coalition of 3 former chiefs of staff of the army. Folks, I don't know if anyone on this call is a former chief of staff of any particular army, but they are not humble people. They have egos the size of the Empire State Building, and they think they're right, and they think everyone else on earth is stupid, and if you don't follow them, then you're wrong. He managed to corral 3 former chiefs of staff of the Israeli army into a single party. He managed to bring in Yesh Atid and a man named Yair Lapid at the head of the Yesh Atid party. Yesh Atid is an extraordinary party. It's not large, it's a medium-sized party, but it has probably the most effective, organized, and disciplined grassroots operation of any political party in Israel, including Likud. And they served, the Yesh Atid served as blue and white's grassroots throughout 3 elections, and were part of the reason that they did so well. He held this coalition together, pushed through 3 elections, denied Netanyahu a majority for 3 elections. And then on March 26th, 2020, after a long 15 months or so of building this coalition, holding it together, herding cats is an expression in Hebrew. If it's not an expression in English, it should be. You famously can't herd cats, so if you manage to herd cats, you're very good at herding. He herded these egos and built a competing party to Netanyahu that was the size of Likud, the scale of Likud, and was loyal to itself and to him over 3 elections. It's an extraordinary political achievement, on par with Benjamin Netanyahu's own political skill. And he did it with this quiet, soft-spoken, management style that was how he ran the Israeli army. Just a word on Gantz. Fast forward to our situation today. On March 26th, Benny Gantz is watching Israel's economy collapse, is watching the coronavirus explode all over the world. In the United States today, you're suffering, extraordinarily from this virus. A month ago, the United States was not, but we in Israel are much, much closer to Europe, and we were watching the situation in Italy and the situation in Spain, and how the virus was spreading in Iran. We understood that this was a tremendous danger. We went into lockdown much earlier than most countries. We've suffered much less than most countries. And Benny Gantz made a decision, and he made it in public, and he announced it publicly. And he said, look, we could go to a 4th election. Polls say I'm not going to do so well, but I've gone into an election with worse polls and done better. We could go to a 4th election. I don't think Israel right now, with this virus, with 1/3 of the country unemployed, I don't think Israel can go through a 4th election. This could destroy me politically. I am stopping this 1.5 year long election race across 3 elections, and I am going into negotiations and unity talks with Benjamin Netanyahu. It was an absolutely fascinating moment, because Benny Gantz, in doing so, in announcing that he was starting unity talks with Netanyahu, had 2 problems. His first problem was his coalition was composed of people whose primary objective was to oust Netanyahu. This is an extremely important point to understand. The gap in policy between Likud and blue and white is almost non-existent. On economics, almost non-existent. They are all essentially free market, but with a strong state. Mitt Romney once visited Israel as a candidate for president, and Mitt Romney is an old friend of Netanyahu's. They worked together at Boston Consulting Group back in the, I want to say 70s, I'm not sure. He met with Netanyahu, and they all played up how Benjamin Netanyahu and Mitt Romney are good friends. And I wrote a little snarky piece just because sometimes it's fun to write a snarky piece, in which I said, I sure hope Mitt Romney, the Republican presumptive nominee, doesn't ask Benjamin Netanyahu about any domestic issue that defines the Republican agenda. I hope he doesn't ask him about healthcare, where he will discover that Benjamin Netanyahu is to the left of Bernie Sanders. I hope he doesn't ask him about abortion. I hope he doesn't ask him about, just about anything. I mean, I guess religion and state, Israel is to the right of Attila the Hun. But on all other domestic issues, Israel is not anywhere in the spectrum of American political debate. What makes Netanyahu very close to Republicans is essentially foreign policy. On domestic policy, Israel has a robust, effective, universal healthcare system. Israelis, by the way, have longer lifespans than they should by their GDP per capita. They're a little bit out of the graph of countries with GDP to lifespan. And one of the reasons is our very effective universal healthcare. So Netanyahu is a free market Republican, neocon, hawk, capitalist, Israeli style, for a country with a very strong socialist past. And Benny Gantz is a left-wing socialist who believes in the free market and supports an aggressive foreign policy. Not only are they similar in the end, they come from two different ends, but end up in the same place politically on all major issues. But in fact, when Benny Gantz was chief of staff of the army in the 2014 Gaza war, Netanyahu actually, with Gantz, forged Israel's policy toward Gaza, and a large part of Israel's policy toward Iran in Syria that we're seeing today. Major planks of current Israeli national security policy were actually developed together by these two men. Netanyahu appreciated Benny Gantz, praised him repeatedly back when he wasn't a political competitor, and even extended his term as chief of staff by an extra year. So these are two men who are not divided on policy. They ran in elections to replace to essentially on a personal point. Benny Gantz argues that Benjamin Netanyahu's time in power is over. There are these corruption trials that are set to begin in May, and there are all sorts of other reasons that people want Netanyahu gone. There are no major policy differences, and so Benny Gantz on March 26 enters into this unity talk, and by doing so, he shatters his coalition that had held together for that astonishing year, that coalition that was more than a quarter of the Knesset, that blue and white, all of those chiefs of staff of the army, the Yesh Atid ground operation. And he shattered it in a way that it'll never be put together again. In other words, Benny Gantz knowingly gave up any chance he has of running against Netanyahu again, because he simply doesn't have the coalition, the party, that could deliver the scale that he would need to actually be prime minister if he runs against Likud. His first problem was that if he enters into unity talks with Netanyahu, he shatters his coalition. There was no policy problem because there's no real policy divide. But his second problem, Benny Gantz's problem in March 26 when he decides to enter unity talks with Netanyahu, there's no nice way to say this, so I'll just say it impolitely. Netanyahu is a terrible, famous liar. Netanyahu is a man whose politics are literally predatory. He is not trusted by his own members of Likud. There are most of the upper echelon of the Likud party list have written guarantees from him that have, on paper, that he has never kept, that he has betrayed them on and he has gone back on what cabinet posts they're going to have, on how he's going to vote for certain bills, on what he's going to advance and what he's going to do. Almost the entire Israeli right is led by people who once worked for Netanyahu and personally hate Netanyahu. The heads of Yamina, Naftali Bennett. Naftali Bennett was Netanyahu's aide, personal aide. And Naftali Bennett is a man that Netanyahu hates profoundly, personally, and that personally and profoundly hates Netanyahu. There's this tiny little two-seat Derech Eretz faction that broke off from Blue and White and from Moshe Ya'alon's Telem faction. You don't have to worry about who that is. It's composed of Tzvika Hauser. These are people in Gantz's bloc right now. They're composed of Tzvika Hauser, who is Netanyahu's cabinet secretary, maybe the most senior political appointment, a loyal political appointment of your own loyalists that a prime minister can make, and a man named Yoaz Hendel, who is Netanyahu's spokesman. And they're both anti-Netanyahu members of Knesset working for Gantz. The Telem party is headed by Moshe Ya'alon, a defense minister from Likud, who Netanyahu betrayed and ousted from the defense ministry. The man who wouldn't sit with Netanyahu and on May 30 started this year of elections, Haviv Gur was once Netanyahu's top political aide, closest political aide, who in the 80s and 90s actually built Netanyahu's early political operation inside Likud and was the director general of the prime minister's office under Netanyahu, again, one of his top political aides, and today despises him and wants nothing more than to topple him. Netanyahu earned the distrust and the dislike of just about everyone who's ever worked for him, and many of them are today his political problem in the Knesset. Benny Gantz is breaking up his coalition, removing any chance he has of ever ousting Netanyahu in an election, with no guarantees that Benjamin Netanyahu is going to actually fulfill anything he promises. All of these people will tell you they have long, megillas of moments of promises that Netanyahu has gone back on. And so he did something astonishing, again, unprecedented. I'm going to stop using the word unprecedented because literally everything I'm going to say now is unprecedented. None of this has ever happened before in Israeli politics. He told Netanyahu, listen, I am going to start unity talks with you. I'm going to announce it. That will break up my blue and white party. I then will demand from you one thing, and it has to happen immediately, within 3 hours. You are going to have your entire coalition vote for me for Speaker of the Knesset. I'm going to become Speaker of the Knesset, and when I'm Speaker of the Knesset, I will negotiate unity talks with you as the head of the Knesset. Now, he wants to be Speaker of the Knesset for a very simple reason. Netanyahu cannot form a government without him. Now that he's broken up blue and white, why not just form a government, find someone in blue and white to bring him from 59 to 61 seats. He's almost at a majority. And dump Gantz, right? But he cannot have an oppositionist Speaker of the Knesset because the government without a cooperative Speaker of the Knesset simply can't function. The Speaker of the Knesset decides the legislative agenda. You can't pass a state budget. You can't do anything. So Benny Gantz, for the very first time, a candidate for prime minister, as a precondition for unity talks, gets himself elected Speaker of the Knesset only because he doesn't trust his partner, and he wants to make sure his partner can't possibly form a viable government without him. Folks, that's the beginning of the institutions of the Israeli democratic system being warped and twisted into the coalition needs and the deep suspicion and mistrust that these two men have for each other. It gets more interesting. Netanyahu now starts these unity talks. Gantz starts these unity talks. They're incredibly difficult talks, incredibly painful talks. About 3 weeks ago, they're concluded. They have a coalition deal, and they start. They literally schedule a signing, and some of the details of the coalition deal leak. The coalition deal between Benny Gantz and Blue and White. The party's still called Blue and White, but it's only half of what Blue and White was a month ago. The coalition deal has 2 points. One thing that Netanyahu gave Gantz, and one thing that Gantz gave Netanyahu. I apologize for going this much into the weeds, folks. This is what's happening. There are a lot of details, and from the details you get this very large picture. It's essentially one big barter, one big trade. The trade is that the right wing believes that Israel's judiciary and a lot of the legal apparatus of the Israeli state, the attorney general, the various legal advisors of ministries, as a general rule, the legal apparatus and the judiciary are incredibly powerful, incredibly activist, and very, very left wing. And they want to rein them in. They want to change how judges are elected in Israel. They want to change essentially the function of the Attorney General and some other things that we don't have to get into. The Israeli liberal camp, the left, thinks that that would undermine Israeli democracy. We can get into this if it interests people. It's a complex debate, and both sides are right, frankly. Okay, we have the most powerful court in the world. Our high court can stop the Israeli army in mid-battle and check if the Israeli army is obeying Israeli laws of war. Your court, your Supreme Court can't do that. We have an incredibly powerful high court. And the left is right in arguing that we don't actually have that many checks and balances in our system. We have a unicameral parliament. We have a government formed out of that parliament with a majority in that parliament. And so there's almost no checks in the legislative and executive branches. And so there's a reason we have a very powerful court. Everybody's right. It's a complicated debate. We can have that separately. But the point is that Benny Gantz said to Netanyahu, listen, you made a huge promise over the last year to get the right-wing voters out to finally win this thing. It failed to get the right-wing voters out, and it failed to win you this thing. But your promise was that you're going to annex some part of the West Bank. If you annex some part of the West Bank, you're formally and officially announcing that the Oslo peace concept is over. Whatever the Trump peace plan is, which nobody entirely understands in Israel, but whatever it is the new thing, and the Oslo concept of two states, one next to each other, are over. I will give you that annexation. I will agree that you can advance that annexation in the new government. It's an annexation that's going to be limited. It's going to be limited to settlement. It's probably, I can't promise this, but what it looks like is that it's probably going to be limited to large settlement blocks. And that's an important point because the idea of large settlement blocks being part of Israel is Bill Clinton. In other words, it's a consensus view in Israel. It's what Benny Gantz himself wants. It's the Clinton parameters of 2000. The Clinton White House, of course, intended for these blocks to become part of Israel as part of the establishment of an independent Palestinian state and peace and a two-state solution, etc., and land swaps and all of this. It didn't mean for it to be a unilateral Israeli move, but the principle of Israel annexing some of these areas is something that Benny Gantz is very comfortable with. I'm going to give you an annexation so you can fulfill that promise that you made over the last 3 elections. And you're going to give me all control over the judiciary and the legal reforms that you want to push. And I get to freeze the right-wing legal and judicial agenda. That was the compromise. When that compromise became public about 3 weeks ago, the Israeli right rebelled. Netanyahu's most loyal foot soldiers, the journalists, the radio outlets, the television station, Channel 20, which is our Fox News. It's a very right-wing, very pro-Netanyahu channel, television channel, just declared that this was a betrayal of everything it means to be right-wing. Netanyahu got scared, and the entire coalition agreement was scrapped, and they had to go to negotiate around this again. So we've been in this incredibly complicated dance where Netanyahu is trying to form a unity government. Because Benny Gantz is Speaker of the Knesset, he either goes into a government with Gantz or goes to an election. For the very first time, Netanyahu was forced by someone else into a corner. Again, credit to Benny Gantz. You can love him or hate him, but you can't argue he's an idiot. And Netanyahu has this problem where he also has to keep his right-wing base and this right-wing coalition that he built if he hopes to win the next election. So he has to appear to be very right-wing while also having a unity government with a centrist party and with its centrist demands. Or go to a 4th election, right? So, which he doesn't yet really know where the coronavirus crisis is going, where the economic crisis is going. You don't risk an election 90 days down the road when a third of the population is out of work. Last Monday, thank you all for your patience. I'm amazed that I can see the participant number. You're all still here. Last Monday, by the way, we've been following this every day in the news. It's been exhausting. I work in this. It excites me. Most Israelis are exhausted from this politicking. Last Monday, Netanyahu and Gantz finally signed an agreement. There was some very complicated clever agreement on judicial appointments. I argue Benny Gantz won. Essentially, Tzvika Hauser, the former cabinet secretary to Netanyahu, who's now in Gantz's bloc and is a conservative on most issues, a moderate on judicial issues, but sort of considered right-wing. He's going to be a representative on the committee that Netanyahu claims is a right-winger who I once appointed cabinet secretary. It's a kind of everybody wins, but actually everybody loses compromise. Judicial Appointments Committee is going to be okay, and they move forward. They signed the agreement. That was last Monday. It's now been 8 days, maybe 9 days, since the signing of that agreement, and we've all had a chance to read the agreement. Now, I had to read it that day and try and make some sense out of it. And I wrote an article, which you don't have to read. It's a little bit long. I think it's about 3,000 words. But the article essentially said, this agreement, this coalition agreement that was signed last week, is an astonishing document. It is like no coalition agreement we've ever seen. I promise not to say unprecedented again, but I'm going to say it again. Coalition agreements between parties as they enter into a new government usually talk about policies, usually talk about a vision for the country, usually make economic promises, usually hand ministries to various parts of the new coalition. None of that is in this document. None of it. There's no vision, there's no policy, there's no debate on ideology, there's no promise of anything. This is a document, a 14-page, single-spaced, incredibly dense Hebrew legalese, written by lawyers, not politicians, not meant to be read by the public, that creates an incredibly complex series of constitutional amendments that all have to be passed by May 7th, because May 7th is, remember we talked about there's the 49 days and then there's maybe the 21 days, and there's certain periods in law where if you don't form a government by then you automatically go to a fourth election, to another election. Well, May 7th is the deadline. After all the coalition talks of the last month, May 7th is that deadline. May 7th is next Thursday. So all of these constitutional amendments have to pass by May 7th. And these constitutional amendments essentially are statements that Netanyahu and Gantz are absolutely convinced that the other one is going to cheat them at the first opportunity. The new government essentially says it's going to be a rotation agreement where Benjamin Netanyahu is prime minister for the first 18 months of the 35th government, of the new government, and Benny Gantz will be prime minister for the next 18 months, and they're going to rotate. Well, Benny Gantz is absolutely certain that Netanyahu will not give him his 18 months, that as soon as Netanyahu's 18 months are up, remember we're a parliamentary system, a Knesset can dissolve itself at any time with a simple vote. The Knesset, Netanyahu will just arrange that in October 2021, when Netanyahu's 18 months are up, Netanyahu will call a vote to dissolve the 23rd Knesset and go to another election. 18 months from now, the coronavirus crisis will be over. Benny Gantz has no centrist coalition to fall back on, and Netanyahu doesn't have to give up the prime minister's seat. So in this coalition agreement, there is a stipulation, and it is passing now, even now. It passed a committee, and it's going to its first vote in the plenum on Thursday, tomorrow, and then it will go back to committee, and then 2 more votes in the plenum next week. That if a prime minister in a rotation, first of all, it creates a legal institution called a rotation agreement. Gantz doesn't want to have to get Likud in 18 months to agree to vote for him for prime minister. A Knesset has to vote for him as prime minister. So the Knesset now will change its constitutional makeup in order to be able to vote for a prime minister 18 months from now, today. In other words, it's for the first time removing from the Knesset the ability to vote its confidence in a new member of Knesset and a new prime minister. A government in Israel, in principle, cannot exist without the confidence of the Knesset. And they're changing the constitution today to say, you can give that confidence 18 months ahead of time because Gantz doesn't want to have to face the Knesset of 18 months from now and beg it to fulfill the agreement Netanyahu promised. He's absolutely convinced Netanyahu doesn't want to fulfill the agreement. And everyone else in Israeli politics is convinced of that. Not only that, but if Netanyahu nevertheless finds a way to topple the government over the next 18 months, they're creating another constitutional change that says that if you already agreed to a rotation agreement, which is now going to be written into a constitutional law, the basic law of the government, a new kind of government called a rotation government, and if the rotation government falls early, the person who is the alternate prime minister, not the current sitting prime minister in the rotation agreement, becomes the interim prime minister of the outgoing government and goes into the election as an interim prime minister, and then for whatever month, 2 months that it takes to form the next government. So if Netanyahu cheats Gantz, Gantz becomes prime minister automatically for the entire 5-month arc of the next election, because he's absolutely convinced that Netanyahu is going to cheat him. But the Knesset was robbed of its confidence power. The agreement will pass a constitutional amendment that says that if the Knesset votes no confidence in either man while they're prime minister, the other one can't then be elected. It has to be a third member of Knesset. So neither one has the ability to just engineer a no confidence vote in the current one and take the prime minister's seat away and ruin the rotation agreement. In other words, the Knesset can no longer topple these two men. In order to prevent the two men from advancing legislation that would topple them, the current coalition agreement says that they will pass a constitutional amendment. These have all been voted on in their initial vote already in the plenum or in committee and going to the plenum tomorrow. This is all real. The constitutional agreement says that neither one can hold up the state budget. In Israel, in Israeli law, if the government can't pass through the parliament its budget, for a particular calendar year, by March of that year, the government falls and the Knesset falls and we go to elections. In other words, the government has a responsibility to produce a budget the Knesset agrees to pass. The Knesset has to pass it. If the Knesset doesn't pass it, the Knesset itself goes to elections. It's a power of the purse given to the Knesset. It's one of the major powers in all democracies that parliaments have over the government. Neither government of Gantz or Netanyahu, neither prime minister, neither bloc that they lead is now allowed to hold up the budget, because that would force an election, which would be a way for Netanyahu to prevent Gantz from taking over. The coalition agreement, ladies and gentlemen, we discovered after reading it, takes away from the Knesset its leverage over the government in terms of the budget. It takes away from the Knesset its leverage over the government in terms of voting no confidence and toppling the prime minister and voting for a new prime minister. It takes away from the Knesset the right to just confirm a prime minister, which is a fundamental right of the Knesset. By saying that it will vote 18 months ahead for who will automatically become prime minister 18 months later. Benjamin Netanyahu and Benny Gantz despise each other and distrust each other and have produced a basket of constitutional changes that is the entirety of their coalition agreement. There's a single paragraph there talking about how Gantz agrees that Netanyahu is allowed to advance annexation beginning July 1st. That made the news. Obviously that made the news. That's huge news. If you're following the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that's a very significant moment. But it doesn't talk about reasons. It doesn't talk about ideology. It doesn't talk about what kind of annexation. We learn almost nothing about the annexation. All that's written in there is that Benny Gantz is required to let Netanyahu present the legislation on July 1st. It is an agreement by two men whose suspicion for each other is absolute and who are willing to bend Israel's fundamental constitutional order after 18 months of political deadlock. And Gantz entered into these talks because of the coronavirus crisis, which he felt meant we need unity, we need stability. But with Netanyahu, you can't have stability, you can't have unity, you can't have a shared government unless you literally change the constitution to force all of his escape hatches shut. Because he's going to start looking for escape hatches the minute the government is formed. And Gantz, as we noted, has already broken up the blue and white alliance. He has nowhere to go back to. It's astonishing. It's terrifying. I even support some of these constitutional changes. I'd like to see governments that are more stable. We have governments that survive 2 years on average. This government will be, if it's formed in the next week and a half, will be the 35th government, and we're today celebrating Israel's 72nd Independence Day. So even though we elect these people to 4-year terms, governments only ever last 2 years in Israeli history. We have this weird national party list system with the entire country as a single constituency. There is a country that has a similar system. It's called Italy, and it also has these incredibly unstable year-and-a-half-long governments. Not all of these amendments are terrible, but you don't pass them like this. You don't pass them to serve a political moment. You don't pass them without any public discussion. There's almost no time for parliamentary discussion. Most of the members of Knesset aren't sure exactly what they're voting on every time they vote in the various committees that are advancing all these different changes. So we're in a moment of extraordinary change, and it's all happening very fast, and it's all meant to lock down an agreement between two Israeli political camps that deeply, deeply, deeply distrust each other. Two men, really, who deeply distrust each other. And all of this comes to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court will take up 6 different petitions against these constitutional changes beginning on Sunday. In the coalition agreement, it says that if Netanyahu is prevented from being prime minister in the next 18 months, or is prevented from being alternate prime minister 18 months from now, the deputy to Gantz, when Gantz is prime minister, in the next 6 months. The Supreme Court might rule that he can be prime minister, but he can't then be alternate prime minister, which is a brand new thing that they're inventing and writing into the Constitution in the next 2 weeks. Then Gantz and Netanyahu both will vote to dissolve the 23rd Knesset and go to a 4th election. In other words, if the Supreme Court knocks down this agreement and these astonishing changes in which the Knesset hands over the power of the purse, the power to topple a prime minister, the power to choose a prime minister, to these 2 men, to the executive branch. If the Supreme Court rules that this is unconstitutional, then we do go to a 4th election, and Netanyahu will run on a campaign that says the Supreme Court forced us to this election, and then he gets to have his cake and eat it too. He gets to have this campaign against the activist court, which is very popular on the right, while also going to an election that he's probably going to win easily because Benny Gantz has no coalition. So the court's taking up this issue. We don't know how it's going to vote. The constitutional questions are so fundamental and so profound, and at the same time, there's a real sword of Damocles hanging over the court in terms of how the political system would react to certain decisions. The Chief Justice, Esther Chayut, she decided that there'll be 11 justices out of the 15 on this panel. That's an incredible number. I don't think there's been a dozen cases that have had that many justices. Usually it's 3, sometimes it's 1. And the 11 include people like Justice Mintz, Justice Solberg. No reason any of you would know the justices of the Israeli Supreme Court, but justices appointed in the last 4 years who are considered very conservative justices, appointed by the Judicial Appointments Committee led by the Yamina party, Ayelet Shaked, the Justice Minister, and these are justices who, whatever the decision is, if they're on board, the right will have a hard time arguing, that this is some kind of left-wing decision. So they're part of the 11-person panel. There's a lot of dancing between raindrops for Netanyahu, for Gantz, and for the court. So we're going into an incredibly complex week. I'll stop the very long political discussion here, and I have a few comments to say about Israel's response to the coronavirus and some of the issues around Independence Day, all positive. But maybe, Micah, maybe tell me where maybe we should take questions.
We've got a number of questions here. Let me just on that topic in terms of the government. And first, I'm exhausted after after going through all of that. So thank you for summarizing it and updating us. There's a few questions that have to do with Netanyahu, and let me just put out a couple of questions there. One of them is about the charges against him and the upcoming prosecution. What sort of impact might that have on this coalition deal and some of the laws that are passed that you're speaking about? And also just another question, which I find is often a question asked, which is if Netanyahu, has this trust issue with so many people in government, how does he continue to remain so popular amongst the people?
So on the effect of the trial is never specifically mentioned in the coalition deal, but the coalition deal deals with it constantly, almost on every page. If because of the trial, Netanyahu, part of the 6 petitions facing the court that it'll start hearings on Sunday, part of the petitions talk about how the court should rule that a person facing criminal indictment should not be allowed to become prime minister. There is a rule that cabinet ministers who are not the prime minister cannot serve if they are indicted. But the prime minister, because it's a uniquely senior role and it has a special constitutional role, is protected and has various kinds of immunity and needs to be convicted in a final appeal before he has to resign, the sitting prime minister. The legal question here is not what happens to a sitting prime minister. Netanyahu is a sitting interim prime minister, but what happens before they are actually elected prime minister by the Knesset? Can the Knesset, in Hebrew we say melechatchila, right? From the very beginning, can the Knesset elect an indicted person prime minister? And that's a question the court's going to take up. I would say that in ordinary times, the court would say, absolutely not. There has to be standards. Why a cabinet minister but not a prime minister? Once they're prime minister, the Constitution says something very specific. The basic law of the government says he can stay in office till the final conviction. But before he's prime minister, let's set an ethical standard. It's our ethical standard everywhere else in the public service. A judge can't serve indicted. A justice minister can't stay in his position if he's indicted. So why should a prime minister be appointed while under indictment? So I don't know how the court's going to rule. It wants to rule that Netanyahu can't, but it would in effect topple Netanyahu and force elections. And we've already been through this. Netanyahu's popularity has held steady, not only as he is famously, all Israelis know that his supporters don't think he's going to keep his promises to Gantz. Gantz doesn't think he's going to keep his promises to Gantz. The left and the Arab parties and everyone under the sun, the ultra-Orthodox parties who are his loyal allies, don't think he's going to keep his promises to Gantz or his promises to them. He's keeping his promises to them because it's convenient for him politically. So everyone knows this. Voters know this. He was indicted between the second and third elections. He actually had the indictments filed and was going to go to trial this month. Because of the coronavirus crisis, the courts shut down for a couple of months. The trial will now begin next month. And voters knew that when they went to the polls on March 2nd, that he was indicted, that he faces a trial on it was going to begin on March 17, knowing that he faces a trial 2 weeks from now. His base held steady. His vote count held steady. What is the source of his popularity when everyone in Israel knows what I say? By the way, to an Israeli audience, everything I've said about him in this conversation isn't even a criticism. It's just, yes, he's a terrible man. Yes, you don't want to drink a beer with him. It has nothing to do with why people vote for him. I'm seeing a little bit of color of light changes. Are you seeing that?
A little bit, but I think everything's holding up.
Okay. The simple answer is he has spent the last 11 years as prime minister, but more than that, he took over a Likud in 2006. In late 2005, when Ariel Sharon abandoned Likud after the Gaza disengagement, formed the Kadima party, won, I think, 34 seats. Benjamin Netanyahu led Likud in the 2006 election to an election that shattered the party. It was 12 seats. He led the party across the 3 years of the Olmert government, really in the desert. They weren't, I don't think they were the 4th largest party in the Knesset even. And then in 2009, rebuilt a shattered Likud that, because he came in and rebuilt it, was built around him. And won the 2009 election, won the 2013 election, won the 2015 election, and he did it by essentially delivering for Israelis. I actually think that Rabbi Lindemann, when I met your group a couple of years ago, I think this was our conversation. In the wake of the 2000 Second Intifada, the wave of 140 suicide bombings in our cities that shattered the Israeli political left, that shattered the Israeli faith in the Palestinian capacity for delivering peace, for reciprocating Israeli withdrawals with peace. I'm not saying the Palestinians can't reciprocate Israeli withdrawals with peace. I'm saying Israelis don't believe that they can, which is a more important fact, I think, than the objective reality in terms of understanding what's happening. In that period, Netanyahu, we'd gone through this period of incredible optimism, incredibly complex experiments, withdrawal from Gaza that everybody thought would end well. It was an extremely popular event when it happened in August of 2005 when Ariel Sharon said, look, they're not giving us peace, but what the heck are we doing there? Do we really want to stay there, integrated in with the Palestinian population, facing not only their violence, but also an occupation that we're imposing on some parts, or in some places, large parts of the Palestinian population? Let's get the heck out of there. And he unilaterally withdrew Israel from Gaza. And then Olmert, his deputy, ran in the 2006 election, promising to do the same unilateral withdrawal from the West Bank and finally separate from the Palestinians after the peace process of the 90s failed so spectacularly in rivers of blood in our streets. So we'd had this experiment from the left of this peace process in the 90s that ended in terrible, terrible violence. Nobody today remembers the Second Intifada. Israeli politics is still reeling from it 20 years later. There's a very big gap in how we remember what happened and what we think happened at that time. We versus just about anyone else in the world. And then in 2005, with the Gaza disengagement, there was this experiment of unilateral withdrawal to separate from the Palestinians, and that ended by 2007 with Hamas taking over in a violent coup in Gaza. A violent coup not against Israel, Israel was gone, a violent coup against the Palestinian Authority. So it turned out that after our withdrawal in 2000 from South Lebanon, where Hezbollah suddenly became much, much more powerful, our withdrawal from Gaza in 2005, it turns out that when you leave a power vacuum in the Middle East of today, that power vacuum is not filled by Jeffersonian Democrats. And therefore the withdrawal from the West Bank looks to Israelis extremely dangerous. I'm talking here about left-wing Israelis. It looks to left-wing Israelis who want a withdrawal from the West Bank as a very, very dangerous step. I'll just say that Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, or the president of the state of Palestine, as the Palestinians call it, is in the, I believe, 14th year of a 4-year term. Which is to say, he won't call elections. And the reason he won't call elections is that we have 14 years of polls of Palestinians which tell us that Hamas would win the elections in the West Bank. And that's exactly the reason most Israelis don't believe we can pull out of the West Bank. So Netanyahu comes into power in 2009 in an Israel that feels as though it had tried these incredibly dangerous experiments for peace, for separation, to free the Palestinians from us, and it failed spectacularly. And not only did it fail spectacularly, we somehow got blamed for the failure, even if the failure came from the Hamas violent coup against Abbas, not even from something we actually had anything to do with. There was no blockade on Gaza in 2005 when we pulled out. In 2006, the blockade came in 2007. Netanyahu takes over, and Netanyahu essentially has spent the last 11 years until this year. That's another thing unprecedented about this year. Spent the last 11 years promising Israelis one thing. He's promised Israelis to do absolutely nothing. No peace process, no withdrawal, no annexation, no massive growth in settlements. Settlements have grown slower in the last 11 years under right-wing Netanyahu governments than in the previous 10 years under left-wing governments trying to figure out how to get out of the West Bank. Netanyahu has been a status quo man. He said, he calls it responsible. He said, I'm the responsible adult. In the 2015 election, he actually had a viral video that won an American Campaign Managers Association video ad contest. And the video was him as a kindergarten teacher walking into a kindergarten, and the kids are throwing things, and the kids are loud and screaming and yelling and arguing, and the kids are the leaders of the other political parties. And the ad was essentially, I'm the adult in the room. Look, there's the left-winger promising us that he'll give us this piece and that piece. There's the right-winger thinking that we can scream and yell and annex everything. There's all these crazy kids around. I'm the adult in the room, and I'm going to make sure that only irresponsible things happen. He is credited with the Iran situation, which has essentially been a success. Israel has managed to really turn the hinge on Iran. Most Israelis are on board with Netanyahu on that. So he earned a reputation in a very broken Israel, an Israel that was doubting its politics and doubting the capacity of its politics to deliver on its most fundamental needs and fundamental problems. And those fundamental needs and problems are, terrible, bloody, challenges, military challenges. He earned a reputation as a man who can hold the line and can be very, very responsible and moderate and thoughtful and careful. And that changed this year when, in order to win the election, really in desperation, he suddenly came out and promised an annexation in the West Bank, something he had never done before. The day after he announces that promise, which was, I believe, in the fall, the day after, he suddenly clarifies to some journalists, yeah, of course, I don't mean the West Bank. I'm talking about some parts of the Jordan Valley. I'm talking about some parts of the settlement blocks. 80% of it Bill Clinton would sign off on. It's suddenly something much, much more limited. We still don't know what exactly he means by annexation in the West Bank. That's the source of his support. Careful, serious steward of the economy. Folks, they talk a lot about him being a Donald Trump as a supporter, a friend. Trump supports him. They like each other. Benjamin Netanyahu is not a Donald Trump. Benjamin Netanyahu reads books. Benjamin Netanyahu is a profound man, a thoughtful man, a careful man. Look at Trump's response to the coronavirus and look at Benjamin Netanyahu's response to the coronavirus. They're opposite responses. Benjamin Netanyahu calculates that Donald Trump will do things for you on the global stage if you stroke his ego. And that calculation has led Benjamin Netanyahu over the last 4 years to just stroke away Donald Trump's ego. And he's gotten everything he ever asked for from the man by doing so. But that's where Netanyahu is, in terms of as a populist and things like that. So there's a real source of support that's very real. I don't think Israeli voters are unaware, and I don't think they're stupid. There are good reasons to vote for Netanyahu, even if you know his personal failings.
So the next set of questions are essentially about, while all this is going on in Israel, this instability with the government, to put it lightly, what has it affected Israel's ability to defend itself with Gaza, with other enemies, other challenges out there in the world? And there was a question too. You spoke a little bit about Netanyahu's opinion of President Trump. What about Gantz?
Yes. The vast majority of things that we need our government to be doing, fighting Iran in Syria, deterring Hezbollah, holding the quiet in Gaza, which is a quiet you hold with a tremendous amount of planning and power and operational skill in the field, the government is doing. And, we have a defense echelon, planners, policy people, Mossad, the Shabak, which is our sort of FBI, and our army, which have all been extremely effective. None of that leadership chain has been broken by this political crisis. It's also, important to note that as each Knesset dissolved itself, the 20th dissolved to the 21st, the 21st to the 22nd, the 22nd to the 23rd, in the interim, you couldn't form Knesset committees, you couldn't pass legislation, but they did form the Knesset Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, which oversees the army, approves the budget changes in the army. They've appointed generals. They have maintained Likud and blue and white despised each other, hated each other, don't trust each other as far as they can throw each other. But Likud said, that blue and white's member of Knesset, Gabi Ashkenazi, who's also a former chief of staff of the IDF, can be the chairman of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee while the Knesset and while we're negotiating and fighting. And so there has been both oversight and budgeting. And those parts of the Israeli state are just phenomenally competent. They're good, they're functioning. We literally just have a very competent bureaucracy. You saw it in the coronavirus response. You see it generally in our economic, fiscal, financial, monetary handling, the state budget and monetary policy and so forth. And you see it in our military. And those systems are independent of the political crises. Also, Netanyahu and Gantz, as I said, they don't disagree on the defense budget. They don't disagree on what the army needs to do. They don't disagree on some airstrike in Syria. So Naftali Bennett, the current defense minister, ordered an airstrike in Syria. Benny Gantz, the Speaker of the Knesset, was notified about it. Benny Gantz said, "Great, well done. If you need anything, let me know." So on those fundamental issues, they continued cooperating even in this incredible political turmoil. But we're about to hit a brick wall that will hurt our security and will hurt a lot of other things. And that is that this Knesset hasn't passed a budget. We are now, the 2019 budget obviously ended in December of 2019, and we are now in 2020. We are already in April, and the state is still operating on the 2019 budget. Now, the global economy has changed. The budget needs to fundamentally changed. The army hasn't had an increase in its budget to correct for inflation. It hasn't had, there's an enormous reform currently going through the military that has just been frozen because they can't rejigger the budget in the new year. We haven't yet seen a crash from that. There have been some emergency stopgap budget changes that were approved by a Knesset committee sort of haphazardly. But at some point, the fact that we're still operating on a previous year's budget and there isn't a serious, clear thinking and changing of the budget to correct for all the things you need to correct for year on year is going to really affect the army. It'll stop having the money to bring in more troops. It'll stop being able to operate as effectively. So right now, everything's fine. Israel's defended. The state is fundamentally competent. Not all the politicians, but everyone under them. Gantz's relationship with Trump. Benny Gantz has made a show of having a relationship with Trump. Trump likes Netanyahu. Trump doesn't want to help Gantz against Netanyahu. But Gantz might be the next prime minister, and Trump still wants to look pro-Israel. He has a lot of evangelical voters, a particular part of the Jewish community that supports him, that he's a little bit, I think, in terms of his own sort of narrative of himself, committed to having that support and wanting to keep that support. And so he wants to be friends with the next prime minister, if that's Gantz as well. Gantz doesn't know if he's going to win in November, so it's important for Israel. People think we're big and powerful, and we're always talked about, and we're always criticized. You criticize the powerful. Nobody criticizes the Dalai Lama, right? Everyone criticizes China. Even if there's something to criticize about the Dalai Lama, there's too much to criticize about China. So we're so big that people can be, I think, very, very critical of our political relationship with Trump without realizing that in our minds, we Israelis, we have a smaller population than Belgium. We're a small country. And for someone like Benny Gantz to look at the president of the United States, who still wields, the executive powers of the entire federal government of the United States, we can't afford not to be friends. So Gantz has made a show of being friends with Trump. I'm absolutely convinced that he hopes Biden wins, but it'll just be easier for him. He and Biden, I think, are much more on the same page on many issues. And I suspect that if Netanyahu ends up being ousted, Trump will find a way to be friends with whoever's prime minister of Israel.
Right, so one clarification question on the Knesset and the new government and that deal. So can the Knesset bring down the government such that neither Gantz nor Netanyahu can run and a third individual can run?
The Knesset can do so. The agreement stipulates that Gantz and Netanyahu will both vote to go to a new election. If the Knesset votes no confidence, first of all, to get out of the coalition deal, the laws that they're passing now, they're taking a bunch of different constitutional amendments and passing it as a single bill. That bill protects itself by demanding a 75-member Knesset majority, 75-vote majority in a 120-seat Knesset, not a 61, which is the majority, but actually 75, to overturn anything or amend anything in the bill. There are about 78 votes in the Netanyahu-Gantz unity coalition, so it's enough. They can do it. They can amend the agreement together, but 75 means neither can amend it alone. And assuming that Netanyahu's allies stick with him and Gantz's allies stick with him, the Knesset can't then vote for a third person simply because there aren't the votes. If the Knesset is so disgusted by this agreement and by these fundamental changes and by the weakening of the parliament to support these two men's suspicions of each other, that they just give, those coalitions break apart and they give up on Gantz and Netanyahu, then you could see that kind of coalition. But it'll be very hard to put something like that together, and not only to put it together, but then to agree on the third MK who will become prime minister, right? They'd have to negotiate a new coalition without Gantz, without Netanyahu, without any of the Gantz-Netanyahu supporters who would resist a move like that. So I think in practice, no. I think in practice, we're locked into these two men.
And you keep saying constitutional amendments. Of course, Israel doesn't have a constitution. So what exactly do you mean by the resolutions to the basic law, or what does that mean?
Yeah, Israel does not have a constitution. The Knesset in 1949, the first elected Knesset, thought about writing a constitution, never got around to writing a constitution. And over the years, essentially it passed a law when Israel was formed out of the British Mandate. The Knesset passed a law that said that we adopt into the new state of Israel all of the laws of the British Mandate, and we will slowly replace it with indigenous Israeli law. And so some of the things that we adopted from the British Mandate that are leftovers, some of them from Ottoman times, are, for example, the Chief Rabbinate of Israel. The Chief Rabbinate of Israel is an old British institution that is based on the millet system of Ottoman law that we still haven't gotten around to creating an indigenous version of our own. And that's why we still have this state rabbinate that American Jews dislike, and I as well. But essentially, Israel has been writing its own laws to replace them, including very, very fundamental constitutional laws called basic laws. So we have our own, we've completely rewritten, our criminal law, our torts law, real estate law, you name it, we've rewritten. It's all indigenous, modern Israeli law. But fundamental questions of religion and state, things that there has never been a consensus in the Knesset to change, as to what the new law will be. Nobody likes the rabbinate. The ultra-Orthodox who get paid by the rabbinate don't like the rabbinate. But there's no agreement on what would replace it, and therefore it survives, 72 years. The basic laws that have been passed, the basic law of the judiciary, the basic law of the government, the basic law of the Knesset, these are basic laws that include some of the basic ways that these institutions interact with each other, their checks and balances on each other. There's a basic law of the president, really fundamental issues. And then we have two basic laws. These are the famous ones. These are the important ones that were both passed in 1992, both written by a man named Amnon Rubinstein, left-wing member of Knesset, former education minister, former dean of the Tel Aviv University Law School, and the father of Israel's constitution, essentially. And they're called Basic Law Freedom of Vocation, which gives Israelis economic rights, and a Basic Law of Human Dignity and Freedom. Human dignity and freedom includes it's our Bill of Rights. It's the right to privacy, it's the right to leave the country and to enter the country. It's fundamental rights that we have. And there's a right to dignity, which on the right to dignity, courts have ruled all kinds of things. For example, you're not allowed to discriminate. We don't have a right to equality in Israeli law. The ultra-Orthodox have not allowed the Knesset to ever pass a right to equality. The Iranian constitution has a right to equality. The North Korean constitution has a right to equality, which tells us that a right to equality doesn't give you equality. But we don't have it because a right to equality would dismantle the rabbinate, would dismantle the religious institutions where men and women can't be equal and things like that. So we don't have it, but nevertheless, even though we don't have a right to equality, we can sue each other for discrimination, and we do that based on this right to human dignity. So we have these basic laws. Some of the basic laws can be changed very, very easily. The fundamental basic law, human dignity and freedom, was passed, I think, by 32 votes. 3/4 of the Knesset wasn't there that day. They just literally didn't realize that was what was coming up for a vote, didn't bother showing up. 6 people voted against it, which is itself interesting. But again, there was no serious debate. It was something that passed a little bit under the radar. Some laws require 61 votes to change. Some elements of some laws require 90 votes to change. For example, the basic law of the Knesset requires that 90 members of Knesset are required to remove a sitting speaker. Benny Gantz had himself elected speaker, Benjamin Netanyahu has no way to kick him out because you need 90 MKs. So we don't have a constitutional system in the sense that it takes a huge majority to change it, and this constitution is therefore very, very rock solid, and these are the rules of the game. As we see now, the Knesset is about to pass massive changes to our constitutional order in these basic laws that say how the Knesset, the government, and the courts all check each other with simple majorities, with 61 MKs, maybe 70, if they all show up that day. So we have a constitution, and it's incredibly weak, and it's still in the process of being developed. There are many questions. The role of the High Court. What is justiciable? When does the Knesset pass a law that the court can strike down? That's not something that's clear either in our precedent, judicial precedent, or in any constitutional law. So we have a constitution. We can change the constitution. There are rules to how it operates, but they're a little too flexible. They're not a constitution in the American sense.
I want to transition a little bit as we're moving towards the end of our time to the effects of COVID-19 in Israel. Some questions about the effect on the economy, on the tourism industry, and also some of what we've seen in the conflict with some of the yeshivot that won't close in the ultra-Orthodox. I'm just curious how it's affecting Israel on a larger scale. You spoke about a third unemployed, I think is what you said, but just if you could speak a little more about other aspects of Israel and COVID-19.
Yeah, I think maybe the major thing is really the economic crisis. We're going into this with a significant deficit, and so the government has been a little bit hampered in responding. Because of the political crisis, we have no state budget that really has corrected for some of these issues. We can't massively change the welfare budget, the health budget. So the state has been a little bit, had its hands tied. And we've seen with this lockdown just a collapse of entire industries that are fundamental to the Israeli economy. Tourism is enormous in Israel and a major supplier of foreign currency, jobs. I can tell you on my street, there are two couples on my street, both husband and wife. They have little kids, both of them, and both husband and wife are tour guides. Both husband and wife have had all work dry up for the foreseeable future. In other words, if in 5 months the tourism starts coming back, that means the first tourist lands in Israel 6 months after that. So they're going through a couple of years with 100% of their household income just evaporated. And that's something that's happening all over Israel in industry after industry after industry. There's real desperation. Israelis also don't save much, a little bit cultural reasons, a little bit financial incentives, a little bit because salaries aren't that high compared to the rest of the developed world. So the economic crisis is real, and I think we're only starting to grapple with it. One of the reasons Netanyahu is looking like he's going to form a government with Gantz and not call a fourth election, even though in polls he would win that fourth election, is that he's looking at the economic numbers and saying, I can't risk, in 90 days to have the people make decisions about me when unemployment hit 30% at one point of people who were working 3 months ago are now looking for work, are now registered as unemployed at the unemployment office. So the economic crisis has been real and urgent and profound, and some families are just being devastated by it. We're looking at what coming back from that will look like. They're starting to open schools now. The lockdown has been effective. It was early and it was handled well. And so we only have about 200 dead in Israel, which compared to Belgium or Italy or Spain or even Germany or Britain, which are very competent countries and healthcare systems, have done much worse in their decision making. And have huge death tolls, even per capita, unlike anything we've experienced. So they're starting to ease up. They're starting to reopen schools on Sunday, and we're hoping that everything starts coming back. Just as a little vignette, the people who have lost their jobs on my street have started baking and buying produce and selling produce on the street, and the whole street buys from them. and that's how they're paying their mortgage. And that's something that's happening all over Israel. Everyone's sort of helping each other prop up during this time. We're all coming closer together. Unfortunately, we're being forced to come much closer together by the emergency. So it's big. It's very very painful. I think I don't exactly know about the United States. The United States is a big place. A lot of places I think have a different experience, but certainly in the New York area, I think maybe it's been even worse than anything we've experienced in Israel, probably also economically.
So just to conclude here, and I want to thank you again for your time and for speaking to us. A lot of challenges out there in Israel and the government coming and everything you spoke about, and of course COVID-19. And here we are celebrating Israel's 72nd birthday. What are just kind of some general reflections you have in terms of where Israel's at right now and where it's going?
Thank you for ending with that. Listen, really, this is the most important thing. This political crisis is real, it's long-standing, the deadlock is profound. One of the biggest arguments against Netanyahu remaining prime minister is just how divisive and how much he is the driving force behind the deadlock. Another Likud member of Knesset, as a candidate for prime minister, would have had a coalition back in May, and we wouldn't have had the last year. Because Avigdor Lieberman would have gone with him. There's a tremendous personal animus with Netanyahu, and also tremendous support for Netanyahu. Both these things are true. It's so easy to get lost in in the weaknesses of our political class. Folks, Israel is tremendously competent, tremendously tight-knit. There's a solidarity here that is hard to experience, certainly in the West, and I think in most countries. We have polls about Israel, constant polling of Israel. Israelis are one of the most polled people in the world. By Gallup, by the United Nations, that tell us Israelis say that they're very happy. Israelis have a very complex and diverse culture. Israeli Jews have a very complex and diverse Jewish culture because it comes from so many places. We are seeing incredible statistics now in opinion polls for Israeli Arabs who are talking about how they're feeling for the first time an incredible sense of shared fate and solidarity and belonging in Israel. The fact that a quarter of Israel's doctors and a huge number of the most senior doctors. Arabs are overrepresented in the senior levels of Israeli medical hierarchies compared to their population, to their percent of the population. Israelis are being saved by the Arab minority from the coronavirus in a way that no one can ignore, and no one can, and the Arabs themselves tell pollsters that they're feeling very proud. There is the tremendous, deadlock with the Palestinians. It hasn't changed, but it hasn't changed in 20 years and 30 years. The Israeli left has no answers. So that's an 11-hour talk. So at some other time. There's so many problems, and there's so many angst-inducing, anxiety-inducing things that we could get caught up on. And we should, and they're important. I am writing and worrying and staying up nights about the constitutional crisis that we're facing in Israel. At the same time, our democracy wasn't created by our constitution. In America, Americans are taught. I apologize for telling you about yourselves. It's a very Israeli thing to do, so I'm just going to keep doing it. But in America, you're taught that your constitution gave you liberty, and gives you liberty, and creates the separation of powers and all the things that ensure liberty. Israel hasn't had a constitution and built a democracy without really ever experiencing a democracy. Israeli Jews come from Tsarist Russia and Yemen and Morocco, and built here a democracy that was rooted in some social realities and the desire of people to build here a democracy, and survived tremendous pressures and emergencies and wars and crises. At the end of the day, Netanyahu is not Recep Erdogan of Turkey. He is not an end to Israeli democracy. He is a Democrat. Benny Gantz is a Democrat. When you look at a lot of countries facing elections, the very fact that we have these two incredibly competent people as the two options, and they hate each other and distrust each other, and there are constitutional changes now because of how much they hate each other. But if these are the two, one of these two is going to end up Israel's leader, then Israel will be in good, competent hands facing the challenges of Iran and Gaza and the global economic crisis and the coronavirus crisis, etc. So we are in good shape. We're in much better shape than we ever had a right to hope to be in. We have a country that is happy, that has tremendous solidarity. Israelis say it. Happiness and a sense of solidarity is rising in the polls. Go to the Israel Democracy Institute website. I think they have a poll yesterday. Solidarity and happiness of being Israeli is through the roof in this crisis. I think things are going to be okay for us. And considering the gravity of the current situation and all the terrible things that are literally my profession to tell people, all the bad news, that's a lot to be thankful for. Israel is 72 years old. There's never been an Independence Day without the shadow of some terrible looming enemy or crisis or disaster. In 1985, we had 1,000% inflation in a single year and debased our currency. In 1973, Egypt and Syria surprised us and killed most of the men on our front lines. We're winning the war for the first few hours. We don't have many hours of the other guy winning the war to survive. There's never been an Independence Day without some crisis. And every Independence Day has been better and the country has been stronger than the previous one. So there's also never been as much to be thankful for.
Thank you, Haviv. I think that's a good note to end on. I want to thank Haviv for signing in with us, and we'll say Laila Tov to him in Israel. If you do want to read his commentary, you can find it on the Times of Israel website, timesofisrael.com. He always has some excellent and insightful commentary there. It's in English, and you're welcome to, and I encourage you to go there and keep abreast of what's going on in Israel and follow Haviv's analysis as well. I want to thank everyone for being on today, and once again, thank Haviv for being on. Stay safe, stay well, and keep us posted. And we hope to see you in Israel, God willing, someday soon.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. All right. Thank you to everybody. And Chag Atzmaut Sameach. Happy Yom Haatzmaut.